For your presentations, you've selected a topic that you care about, that you're interested in. You also need to have research to back up your knowledge. And we're going to talk about some of what you're looking for in that research. That's called supporting material. The supporting material, as it says here, it's what kind of supports your message. It's what gives it structure. So again, you chose a topic you know, that you like, that you're already familiar with, because that's the better way to do it. That makes the presentation easier. But you still need to back up your knowledge and your understanding with research. The different types of supporting material that you're looking for. The first of them is illustrations. Now, generally we think of illustration as a drawing, but here an illustration means examples. There are 4 types of illustrations: brief, extended, true, and hypothetical. A brief example would be if you're talking about controversies in baseball history. Throwing games for cash, corked bats, and use of steroids are some examples of, or illustrations of, controversies in baseball history. Those are brief illustrations. Essentially, they're just a listing of items. And then we have extended illustrations. An extended illustration is more of a story. It goes more in depth. For example, when I was a freshman in college, I took a psychology class. And the freshmen, or the people taking this entry psychology class, had to do experiments. They had to participate in experiments that the graduate students were doing. The graduate students had to do experiments for their credit, and they needed someone to do experiments on. So it was the undergrads that were taking the psychology classes, the basic psychology classes, that were required to sign up for a certain number of experiments. Now, this was at Ohio State, huge campus, and before we had things like SurveyMonkey. You had to go to the psychology building, and there were a whole bunch of papers in the hallway where you had to sign up for a particular time. Then you had to go back to the psychology building at that time. Most often, these experiments were a quick filling a questionnaire, and you got maybe 1 point or half a point. And we had to get to 10 points. I thought, this is going to take forever, because literally the psychology building was on the other side of campus from where my dorm was. So I decided I was going to knock off a lot of points with a real experiment. So I signed up for a real experiment, and on a Saturday morning, I went in, and they stuck electrodes on my head. I had to look at a screen, and I had to determine, as words flashed up, if those words are positive or negative. If I thought it was a positive word, I pushed one button. If I thought it was a negative word, I pushed a different button. At the end, the researcher explained that what they were looking at is how my brainwaves react differently to different words. The way they were hoping to apply this research was in police science. If they had a crime scene, and they had a suspect, they might be able to hook up the suspect to these electrodes, flash pictures of the crime scene, or words that had to do with the crime. That if someone had never been to that crime scene, didn't see anything about it, their brainwaves would react differently than someone who had been at that crime scene and knew something about it. So if I want to talk about how technology can help police solve crimes, that could be an extended illustration. It's also a true illustration. True illustrations are something that has actually happened. Now you see, that was a bit more of a story, and that went into depth. The first we talked about was brief illustrations, listing things. It's okay to list once in a while, but if all you do in your presentation is list, then you're not going into enough depth. So listing occasionally is fine, but sometimes you want to go into more extended examples. We already talked about the true examples, or true illustrations, and then we have hypothetical illustrations. A hypothetical illustration is something that has quite likely happened, but you don't have a specific incidence of it. So if you're talking about Make-A-Wish Foundation, you might say something like kids being to be a firefighter for a day, going to Disney World, or having a parade in their honor are all examples of the wonderful things that Make-A-Wish Foundation has done for children. Those things have very likely happened. You don't have to have an example for every single one that you looked up. They might be an hypothetical illustration. So hypothetical is something that has likely happened, but you haven't researched a specific incidence. So it's not that aliens exist or Bigfoot's real. That's not a hypothetical illustration that we're talking about here. So when you're doing research, illustrations might be one of the things that you're looking for. You're also looking for descriptions. Now with descriptions, you are describing through the senses. You really want to make sure you describe. You want the audience to picture the same thing that you do. So if you're talking about what it looks like outside, go outside and listen and look and see how things feel. What do you smell? Think about a summer's day. What do you hear? You hear lots of birds. What do you see? You maybe see lots of sun and maybe shade from the trees. You see lots of people out. You hear those people talking. If someone just cut the grass, you smell that. If it's fall, it's very different. There's a different scent in the air when it's fall. I had a student who actually did a presentation on the scent of the air after it rains. There's been studies on that. And you want to be able to describe it to people. If you're out in the fall, you hear things different than you would in the summer. You hear crunching of leaves. In the winter, it's going to be very different again. It's going to feel like a bitter cold maybe out there. It's very different than that warm sun we had in the summer. You're going to see things that are different. The leaves aren't in the trees anymore. It's quieter out because there's not as many people. You may hear the crunching of snow under feet. You may hear slushiness as cars run through the streets. You really want to describe things for people so it makes it vivid in their minds. If you just say, oh, it was cold, that's not very interesting. It doesn't really describe things very well for people. Explanations are something else you might be looking for in your research. Help an audience understand why a situation exists, the conditions of a particular situation, events that have happened, or processes that might lead to something. For instance, the Arab Spring. You may not have heard of that. You're quite young when it happened. So maybe you've never heard of this. But it's something that's important. A lot of people in your audience haven't heard about it as well. But maybe you want to explain it, or it's necessary to explain it to understand the rest of your presentation. Take time to explain things so the audience understands situations. Definitions are something else you might be looking for. Two types of definitions, classification and operational. The classification definition is just your basic dictionary definition. Operational definition is defining something by how it works or what it does. So an operational definition of a fan. Take a second and think of what that would be. A fan is a machine that has a motor that turns blades, and the blades push air. If we had no idea what a fan was, that might help us to better understand. When you're defining things, keep in mind, what does the audience already know? Don't over-define. If it's something that's general knowledge, don't define it. But if it's something the audience might not understand, be sure to define it. Because if you don't, you're going to lose the audience. If they don't know what you're talking about, they're just going to tune out and not pay attention anymore. And you don't want that to happen. So be sure to define things the audience may not know. Analogies. Analogies help you to explain information. And this is kind of